Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for today's SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today on the Roundup, we're going to be taking a look at 3 questions we're hearing from international educators over the last few days, and hopefully answering those today with some helpful tips and articles that may provide some more details on the topic at hand. So obviously today is a landmark day in the United States. And certainly for international educators around the country and probably around the world, a day where we can finally breathe a sigh of relief because Donald Trump has left the building, thankfully, and we can put his legacy behind us that will have lasting impacts, no doubt, but one on which on Inauguration Day 2021, when Joseph Biden will become our next president and dramatically change the way the world hopefully looks at us and how international students will be viewing the United States for the next 4 years. Now today, obviously, there are going to be a series of executive orders coming out after the inauguration, which has happened already. As soon as his team gets to work, he's probably got them loaded and ready to go. Many of them are going to be immigration related and COVID related. So we're going to see what happens with all those, and next week on the Roundup we'll certainly focus quite a bit of time on the implications of new policies from the Biden administration. So let's get right to the questions. Before we do that, though, we do want to say obviously a special shout out to those watching live here on Facebook, those that take the time to watch on repeat, either on the Facebook page for SMIE Consulting or on our YouTube channel. Always a pleasure to get your eyes on what we're talking about each week. And also a special shout out to those that have made the downloads of our Roundup, audio downloads of our podcast for the Midweek Roundup, crossing the 1,000 barrier a couple weeks ago and looking onward to bigger and better things in 2021 for the podcast as well. So thank you for making us a part of your week. And as we do every week, we issue a newsletter for SMIE Consulting on Mondays called All the SMIE News Fit to Share, and that's social media and international education news. So we take themes that we see coming from news stories that have popped on our radar, and then focus on 3 of those topics, general topics, and come up with a question that we can spend some time answering here on the Roundup on Wednesdays. So if you need to subscribe to the newsletter, I'm putting the link to the most recent newsletter in the comments section on the Facebook page, but if you're listening on the podcast or watching on repeat on YouTube, you can go to smieconsulting.org/subscribe, and there'll be a subscribe button to the SMIE Consulting e-newsletter, and you'll be able to get this in your inbox Monday mornings, 9 a.m. Now for today, we're going to be starting out with an interesting question that we're hearing multiple sides on in course of what's happening next, or once the pandemic's over, what's the result going to be? And the question is, will there be a big post-COVID wave of international mobile students? And from what I've seen arguments on both sides, and we're going to cover a couple of those here today in terms of what the future might hold. Certainly, when we saw at the Open Doors report back in November, during that briefing, Alan Goodman, the president of IIE, president and CEO of IIE, suggested that there's going to be substantial pent-up demand for international study, and certainly for the United States, that would seem to be the case from his perspective. We've seen just in the past few days an article from Rahul Chadha, who's now with GMAC, but has been doing quality research on international student mobility for many years. I've had the pleasure of knowing Rahul for at least the last 15 years, and he's certainly a legend in the field of research in international ed, and certainly one of the thought leaders that I look to for key trends as we see changes coming in our profession. And certainly he's documented over the course of the last 15 years or so what he calls the waves of international student mobility. And until now, he's called them the 3 waves of international student mobility basically in the last 20 years. Wave 1 was shaped by the terrorist attacks in 2001. resulting in the U.S. losing attractiveness as a country for international students, losing ground to Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Wave 2, triggered by the global recession in 2008, prompted many U.S. universities to become more proactive in recruiting international students, and it also coincides with the rise of Chinese undergraduates in the United States. And then Wave 3 began in 2016 in the wake of Brexit and the election of Donald Trump in the United States and other very populist, nationalist movements electing leaders in various countries around the world. There seemed to be that wave that's created perceptual and real barriers to higher education for globally mobile students. And now Rahul is saying that there is now a fourth wave, the factors that are shaping a fourth wave of international student mobility. And he's including some recent data that there obviously pandemic is inducing economic uncertainty. It's reshaping prospective students' journey, considerations of alternatives, but 2 out of 3 GMAC, in a recent GMAC survey of prospective international students who are looking at doing a graduate management program in 2021, 2 out of 3 were not changing their original plans. However, 17% were willing to consider business school closer to home. 14% were willing to adopt online learning. So there may be more of a regional mobility, more along the Asia hubs line or more European hub lines than before. He also says a quarter of respondents in the poll indicated that they're more likely to pursue graduate management education in the U.S. if Biden was elected president. This was before a survey done before the election. So that group of prospective international graduate management students would look like more likely to be coming to the U.S. now with Trump gone. So the European Union, for European Union students after August 2021 won't be eligible for home fee status. There are some universities that are trying to go around that and create scholarships or programs designed specifically for EU-based students to get them close to home fee status. But there's EU and non-EU citizens will now be treated equally in the eyes of UK government for entry into the country for study. And that the graduate route in the UK will allow international students to remain in the UK for 2 years at any skill level after completing their study. That is one that had gone away in 2012. Post-study work rights. So the new visa policies in the U.S. and the U.K. are likely to become more welcoming. Obviously, with the U.S., we're seeing today, or obviously already on Immigration Day or Inauguration Day, that a number of immigration policies are being reversed from the Trump administration by Biden's team with executive orders and other legislation that is likely coming down the pike. He's already said he's looking to make immigration overhaul a part of his initial strategies. So we'll see a lot of this happening over the next few weeks and months. That will certainly paint a much different picture on the U.S. as a destination in terms of policies and procedures and welcoming attitudes towards international students. So Rahul's come up with some interesting takes here. That the journey, obviously, for prospective students is changing. That is influencing their destinations, and it's important that universities stay on top of these trends and be able to answer these trends about, as I've talked about earlier in a series I'm doing for IDP Connect on the 6 Ps of strategic international enrollment management. About the first one, the most important one, is perspective, and having this perspective on the U.S. not as the only destination, that there are multiple very credible destinations for internationally mobile students, and what those destinations have to offer, their benefits, their drawbacks. These are things that institutions need to be aware of. And as they promote their institutions, they also need to be promoting the United States as a destination, particularly to those initial prospects, those that are visiting their website and deciding whether they even want to consider the U.S. or your institution as a destination, by acknowledging that these students have multiple choices and that your lucky to have them considering you as an institution. That is a change in perspective that I think many U.S. institutions need to be making, and this is prime time to do that as we enter a new year, new administration, and that is going to have different policies than the last, and that we need to be aware of what the implications are of those policies on global audiences. So the counterpoint to this maybe seemingly more positive view of post-COVID fourth wave of internationally mobile students is a different article coming out of the Chronicle this past week from Nathan Grawe, who has his article is entitled "How to Survive the Enrollment Bust." So for domestic admissions officers in the U.S., this has been coming for years. We've known about it. There's a demographic bubble that has burst, and that's the number of graduating high school students each year has been declining, and in some regions of the country more than others, impacting in-state recruitment for public schools and regional recruitment for private schools. So when we saw, obviously just with the pandemic itself, an overall decline of 13% in first-time undergraduates enrollments in this past fall is certainly outside what was any projections were going to be. We look at what happened with international students this past fall, declining 43% for new internationals. That's been documented. And we've also talked about one of the main drivers for why that number was so significant is because in the two major destination markets, embassies and consulates weren't open for visa appointments. So those students who were already admitted and wanting to come couldn't even get on a plane. Yes, there was probably some negative implications of the way the U.S. is handling that, and that's going to last for a bit too, depending on how the new administration addresses COVID. But you saw that as a result of those international enrollments were down. And domestic enrollments did fall as well, and that's sadly affecting more low-income families and large minority populations that were seen as the largest groups in that decline of new first-time undergraduate enrollments this fall. So his conjecture was based on this data from this past fall. Again, he does address the persistence of the decline is probably attributable to competition from Canada, Britain, China, among others. And that's not going to disappear, even though our regulatory environment will be changing for the good, hopefully from an international perspective. So he's at least acknowledging the perspective of the competitors, which is good. But it's a short-term view on it, really, in terms of the overall impact and how the different variables work in international education. He's making the contention that international students are unlikely to save us. And that's very much what happened in the 2008 global recession, that second wave that Rahul was talking about, that where a lot of institutions started going abroad, state universities in particular, focusing on overseas markets like China, heavily investing in China, and seeing incredible growth. That was at a time where economically in the country it didn't seem like there was a lot of hope there on that front, but it certainly helped save the budgets of a lot of state institutions at that time. So definitely different counterpoints on those that are worthwhile keeping a look at as we move forward into the next 4 years. But certainly my money is more on the positive side that there will be a rebound, there is going to be pent-up demand, and that because of the new regulatory environment being more favorable, I think because of the welcoming messaging that will be coming out from the administration that will be more welcoming to international students and immigrants, you're going to see a change in TAC in terms of destinations as well. And we'll shift gears now and talk about travel, because that was obviously a major complication for new students looking to come last fall to the U.S. and to many other countries as well. But let's ask the question, what will travel look like for those coming to the United States and other countries in the coming months? We've seen a number of stories about that in the future there are going to be digital health passports that we're going to have when we travel. Those that have traveled internationally before have gone to countries where immigration or immunization records are required. You have that yellow card that you keep with your passport that documents when you had certain immunizations and shots and such. And that is obviously a very simple way of documenting that you have immunizations against diseases and such. But with COVID-19 being having such a global impact on the world, you're now seeing countries like the United States saying that effective January 26, the U.S. will require negative virus tests from international passengers arriving by air. And that's something that obviously testing doesn't eliminate all risks, as Robert Redfield, director of CDC, said. But when it's combined with quarantine, wearing masks, social distancing, travel can be safer, healthier, and more responsible by reducing spread on planes, airports, and a destination. So that is, those went into effect this past week. And that's for those travelers coming into the United States. So that would be something that you will see likely. Airlines actually were doing things like this in the fall for orientations when new students were starting to come. If they didn't have a negative COVID test, some airlines were not letting them get on the plane in the first place. So airlines have been able to do this already, but this is now making it policy for the U.S. so that travelers to the U.S. have documented negative coronavirus tests within, I think it's 3 weeks of their travel. So obviously it doesn't eliminate it completely, because after you test negative, you could end up getting it in 3 weeks before you travel. But that's certainly a precaution that's being put in place. You can see at some point whether it's lawful or not to require, immunizations have been required for students to attend school unless there's a religious objection typically, that in the United States that you could see, and companies there's even some talk that companies can require employees to get the vaccine. Obviously in healthcare, you kind of have to do that anyway, whether that's a requirement of the job. More than likely it will be if it isn't already. But certainly that is going to be one of the things you might see down the road, that COVID vaccines are required for entry into certain countries. Whether that's the United States or not, I don't think that will get to that level. Maybe when there's more globally available, reliable vaccines. Obviously, there are challenges with the current 2 vaccines that we have in the United States that are 2-stage vaccines that require significant cold storage and have very limited shelf life before they can be given. That's not going to be possible in many countries in the world for that to happen in terms of effective distribution. And a couple of the ones coming up, Pfizer and Oxford, are not, AstraZeneca are not certainly the Oxford one, but Pfizer one that's coming out soon is a single dose and doesn't require the cold storage. So that's going to be something that as these kind of vaccines become more readily available globally, that may eventually become a piece of the puzzle for travelers to certain countries. So we'll see what that happens. But at least for now, the negative coronavirus test will probably be what many countries, when they start reopening. Obviously, the U.S. has, interestingly, Trump, in one of his last moves, lifted travel restrictions on UK, Brazil, and other European points of origin. But there's already indications the Biden administration is going to quickly turn around on that and reinstate those bans. So, not sure that's going to be there's going to be movement on that anytime soon. But we'll certainly keep our eyes peeled for future stories on that front. But you look at what the United States has just done with this requirement of the negative COVID-19 test, and you wonder, okay, what are other countries doing? Canada has also recently just done the same thing. Actually, December 31st, shortly before the United States did, they required a negative result to be required for all air travelers coming to Canada, and that's for all air passengers coming to Canada 5 years of age or older will be required to test negative before traveling from another country to Canada. That went into effect January 7th. So, and that is something that must be taken within 72 hours of the traveler's flights. So that obviously very different. And even with that negative COVID test, there is still a mandatory 14-day quarantine to Canada. So Canada is taking entry, is opening the door on entry, certainly in more places than perhaps the United States is, but they are requiring a closer timeline to for the tests prior to the traveler's departure, and they're also requiring a mandatory quarantine period. So that's something that we don't do in the United States, and many folks who I know, friends who were teaching in China and were on their winter break last year at this time. And when China started closing their doors, they were about to return to China to start the spring term or the new school year, and they weren't allowed entry. They've been teaching remotely for a year and are only now getting back into China by the end of January to resume teaching at the school. So they've been basically wandering the earth for the last year. Visiting family in one country and going back to the United States. And one of the comments that they shared was how poor our controls are here in the country. We all know that anyone of us who have traveled certainly realize that the U.S. is not a country that handles lockdowns well. We don't really experience true lockdowns like have existed in other countries. Certainly not like China. But you see when they share coming in, not being asked what countries they've traveled to, if they've had COVID or any of that. None of that was part of their immigration interview. They didn't have any of those forms. Really, no, there was no follow-up, no tracking, no temperature taking when they entered, and that's certainly a real hole in our system, and that's when it comes to health monitoring. So that we're not very good at here in the United States at all. So it'll be interesting to see how travel changes in future. Certainly, I'm not planning any international travel, even if I could right now through the end of 2021. I know I wouldn't feel comfortable traveling abroad, even if it was possible until I have a vaccine, get my shots, and I don't know when that's happening. I'm not holding my breath on it. Probably not till the summer, but certainly. All of this points to a time of change in the way we travel and when we travel. Certainly, recruitment events aren't going to be happening abroad for I don't think this year at all. Maybe late in 2021, but probably not till 2022 will we see somewhat of a return to normal, which is amazing to think of. That it'll have been 2.5 years before most people will have been able to travel for recruitment. And that's a bitter pill to swallow for a lot of us who are so used to being road warriors. But certainly, it's the reality that we all face right at this moment. And we want to look at how other countries are doing on this, because as part of my whole perspective series is having a view, and one of the reasons we do the Roundup every week is to give the international perspective on a lot of these topics, whether it be views of the United States or how individual countries are handling different political issues, or in this case, global pandemics and the impact on their countries. Two countries that we know are incredibly reliant on international students for their university budgets in their countries and for economic development revenue for their countries is Australia and New Zealand. And these two countries have been outside of China, probably some of the most restrictive in terms of entry for individuals and particularly students, which for international students in Australia and New Zealand, if you weren't already in the country when they locked down last February and March, you weren't getting back in. Only recently, with very small pilot projects in the Northern Territories in Australia, and I think they've got 150 PhD candidates or doctoral students in New Zealand that have been allowed back in. But certainly it's not going to be anything near what normal flows have been for international students. And this is going into the start. They were basically zero new arrivals for all of this past academic year, 2020. They're about to start their new academic year, and the doors are not going to be flung wide open anytime soon. In Australia, a recent Pi News article shares that effective immediately, the government is halving the number of international arrivals to New South Wales, Queensland, and Western Australia. And new arrivals is all new arrivals from anywhere in the world, that to a combined 2,500 per week. South Australia would take 600, Victoria 1,200 or 1,120. Priority will continue to be given to returning Australian residents, with an estimated 36,000 residents on the waiting list. So for international arrivals, it's not international students anytime soon, given this report, that if there are 36,000 Australians trying to get back in the country, they are given priority. And if they're limiting 2,500 per week from those three states, New South Wales, Queensland, and Western Australia, Victoria, and Victoria's 600 a week, Victoria's 1,120 a week, South Australia 600 a week, that's 1,700, 2,100, 2,500, that is just over 4,000, 4,200 international arrivals to Australia per week, and those are going to Australian residents first. So 36,000, 4,200, a little over 9 weeks before all of the returning residents have been, if it's just returning residents, just for those six states, that they would be hoping. There was originally a hope in December for New South Wales to have 1,000 students returning each week, and now that's been put on hold because of outbreaks of COVID in the state. There, obviously, COVID in Australia and New Zealand has been handled on a much more comprehensive way than we do here in the United States, or could ever do in the United States. And when they say outbreaks, they're talking a couple hundred cases, and that's average day in Columbus, Ohio, that there are at least that many cases anyway on any given day. On a very good day, there might only be 200 new cases. So they've taken a much more cautious approach to the outbreaks in Australia and New Zealand than we have in the United States, but the impact is going to be continue to be quite significant on Australian institutions. When you look at a Victoria state, 1,120 per week new visitors per week, but that's just new arrivals per week, certainly not for the next 9 weeks to be any international students necessarily. Victoria normally welcomes 100,000 international students each year, and that they had planned to bring students back in semester 1, beginning of their school year, and are instead requiring, the state has said, no, okay, we have to do what the national government says, we're going to focus on returning residents rather than universities. So right now the future is very bleak for international ed in Australia and New Zealand on the same bandwidth, same issues there. They obviously initially handled the pandemic very well, still are really if you look at overall numbers, but they have now just announced that there will be the 8 universities in New Zealand are celebrating the news that 1,000 international students will be allowed to enter the country almost a year after they became stuck offshore. So that's international students who are already enrolled who were enrolled in New Zealand universities as the pandemic struck and locked them out as they were in between academic years. So that is going to be that's minimizes some of the loss they've had. But they're not going to be getting new students in this batch at all. It's just going to be returning students. So still a long way to go for New Zealand and Australia's institutions to get back to normal. But we'll be certainly keeping an eye on that here on the Roundup. I want to say especially thank you to those of you who spent the last 2.5 years of us doing the Roundup. It's been a pleasure coming into your office spaces or work spaces or home office, wherever it may be these days, and sharing our thoughts on these important issues of our day. We'll look to continue that into the next 4 years of the Biden administration, and looking forward to policies and discussions that will have a much different tone than we've had over the last 4 years, and there'll be a lot more positivity about what we've discussed. So we're looking forward to bigger and better things. So until next week, I want to say thank you and congratulations, President Biden, and we look forward to an amazing 4 years from you. Cheers.